What is a derogatory word? Who decides if a word or a term is derogatory? Can the meaning of a certain word change throughout time? Have you ever been offended by someone calling you a certain word? These were some questions I was reviewing during a workshop a few years ago. And I always found it interesting whenever I asked those words about derogatory words. You get different responses. At one of these particular workshops, I remember I was at a historically black university. And as we were talking about a segment called The Power of Language, derogatory words and terms came up. And as the discussion went back and forth, of course, almost 100% of the time, the N-word comes up. And as they were discussing the N-word, there was one white assistant football coach that raised his hand. He was standing in the back. And I saw him and I called on him. He stepped forward and he looked at his colleagues, his fellow coaches from the football team and other coaches on the staff. And he told a story about when he played at that particular institution of which he was now coaching. He remembers as a freshman, he started and he was an offensive lineman. And he talked about how as a freshman, he was getting worn out there. He wasn't playing particularly well and the other team was really dominating him. His black teammates pulled him aside and told him, hey, you got to get in their heads. You got to get them to play outside of their game. So what you need to do is call them the N-word. And they will get hysterical. They'll want to fight and they'll lose their concentration. Well, this coach talked about how that made him feel, not only then, but even to that day, how ashamed he was of himself. But he did feel the pressure because he didn't want to be the one who lost the game. And he said he did it. And he said he hadn't forgiven himself since that day. And he talked in emotional terms. I remember in that room, you could hear a pin drop as he was talking about the mental and emotional turmoil he was going through. And I could see in his eyes that this was the first time he had ever shared this story. So I took it upon myself to ask him, why was that so emotional for him? And he said, because my job was to try to win a football game. It wasn't to insult another man's dignity. And the room went quiet. Hi, I'm Keith Lee. I'm your host for It's About Time. And we're back after a couple of weeks. We took a couple of weeks off to take care of some business. But now we're back. And I'm excited to discuss this topic with you today. Hey, please be sure to subscribe to this channel and add your comments. Today's topic, again, is called Words Matter. And we're gonna drill down on, in this case, we're gonna drill down on derogatory terms, and more in particular, we're gonna talk about the N-word and its use. I'm gonna try to get some different perspectives on it. I'll be sure to share my perspective. This particular word, of course, as you can imagine, has some interest, to say the least, with me in terms of its use and how that's changed. Now, this is not the only derogatory term that's out there. There are many derogatory terms, but what I have noticed over the past few years is that the use of this particular word has a different perspective depending on who you talk to. In this case, for example, generationally. When I ask about this word in workshops, more times than not, the young people make statements like, well, it's not a derogatory term anymore because we've taken the word back. or we've redefined it, or it depends on how you spell it, or it depends on what context is used. And so when I ask them questions like, well, how can you take something back that was never yours? How can the change of a letter or two in a word essentially erase history and its original meaning? I share with them that they have to be careful to understand that history didn't start the day they were born. That derogatory words, more times than not, have a history, they have a lineage, they have an original meaning. And it's one thing to use the word in pop culture and music and in art, but it's another thing if you don't know the original meaning of the word. And so more times than not, I have to be honest, it surprised me when I shared the history of the word, where it came from, what it meant, who it was associated with. I was shocked. Many of them didn't know. They didn't know the history. And I know that for some of you may be hard to believe, so you can imagine my surprise. So that's one of the beauties of being an educator. We're going to talk more about this in just a second. Thank you again for joining us, and stay with us. We'll be right back. So I wanted to be sure to add another perspective to this particular topic related to the N-word. And so I have a particular perspective. I've grown in that sense in terms of the N-word and its use. Now, growing up in LA and being young and to a great degree just ignorant toward a lot of things, me and my friends used the word. But the biggest difference I saw then and now, not to excuse the use of it, but the difference was that we never used it in mixed company, quote unquote. In other words, it stayed within our group. And but anytime we were outside our intragroup, if you will, it was never used. So therefore, we had a problem, big problem. Someone used that word who were associated to us, especially if they were outside of our group. Again, that doesn't excuse it, but it was a fact, and I've heard many people say that. So today, in just a second, I'm gonna be joined by a guest, Dylan Gladney. I got that right. Dylan is a proud graduate of Prairie View University in Texas. He is currently a grad student at the University of Central Florida. He and I talk a lot about sport and social issues. I like to get his perspective because obviously he's of a younger generation. Well, he's of a much younger generation. So I'm interested in his perspective and how he sees the world in terms of this particular issue especially. So he's going to join me, give his perspective a little bit, and again, I want to encourage you to add your comments. Nothing is right or wrong. It's just our perspective. And what I've learned is sometimes we change our mind when we hear someone else and their perspective. Sometimes we don't. That's not the point. The point is to talk about it. Stay right there. Well, we're back. My guest, Dylan Gladney, is joining me to add his perspective on this particular topic. Dylan is a graduate of Prairie View University. Prairie View A&M University.
Don't forget the A&M.
My bad. He's a proud alumnus, let me add that. He's also a student here at the University of Central Florida. And tell us a little bit more about yourself, Dylan.
Okay, so like you mentioned, I'm a graduate student in the DeVos Sports Business Program. So I'm definitely excited to be a part of that. So at Prairie View A&M University, I was a track and field athlete. And then also I am a member of the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. So
all right.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to hear that. But you're all right. You're all right. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Well, good. I'm glad you joined me today. Again, as I introduced earlier, I just wanted to get some different perspective on this particular topic because I think it's important. I think it's important for all of us to discuss this and other derogatory words. This one in particular, obviously for me, because I'm a black man, this word's been uttered at me multiple times in my young life, and it has a sting to me, but I'm of an older generation. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, and I'm not expecting you to answer for all younger folks.
Right.
But does this word have a different meaning for the younger generation?
I would say you obviously have to mention and to note the different experiences that you and I have had with the word. So I guess one of the most recent usage of the words in public is Larry Wilmore at the White House Correspondent Dinner. He was doing the comedic address.
Yes.
And after he finished, this was when Obama was in office. After he finished, he said, "Well done, you did it, my nigga," right? And so for me watching, it kind of meant, wow, like we really got somebody black. My nigga meant in a term of endearment, right? Of somebody being black and somebody being able to accomplish a thing like that. And so, but I understand the power that it does have in a negative light as well. So it definitely matters about the context.
Yes. I took it like unconsciously it gave other people permission to associate Obama with that word. Now, that may not have been the intent, but I think unconsciously it gave people outside of Obama's group permission, not to play semantics, but not power, but permission.
Right, okay.
You know what I'm saying? Permission to slip up.
Right.
Permission to, among their friends, to say it without repercussion.
And so that goes back to me thinking about, a lot of times people say, well, we don't like to say that in front of company.
Right.
And so I've heard people say, equate that to, well, does that mean you don't want anybody else seeing us be black or seeing us, use our culture, if it is in fact a part of our culture.
And that's another.
That's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it part of our culture? So many people would say yes. So some people would say no. They would say that, it was forced upon us.
Right.
And through sort of an unconscious, systematic, oppressive way, it was adopted.
Right.
And then it became accepted, and then it became internalized, then it became unique to a certain culture, but was not allowed outside the culture, therefore empowering that smaller group, without trying to get too deep with it.
Preach.
So you kind of talked about it before, but how was it used in your upbringing in terms of?
So I guess for me, like I mentioned to you earlier, wanting to be, as a black man, a young man wanted to be in the in crowd growing up. You had to rock certain shoes, you had to wear certain clothes, you had to have that Nike on your arm or whatever, and you had to use certain kind of language, right? And the word nigga was a part of that language, along with a lot of other things that people would disagree with.
Right.
But I mean, and it kind of stayed with a lot of us. And so some people, through their understanding and through their experiences, it kind of hit them a little bit differently, and they may have stopped using it, and some didn't.
Some didn't.
But for me, my parents didn't necessarily use it. Then again, we grew up in the South. Their parents grew up in the South, from Louisiana and Texas. And so I think that played a big part of it. I know, like in different regions and different areas of the country, LA specifically.
LA, baby. That's right.
Yeah, it may be thrown out a little bit more loosely.
Could be.
So yeah, definitely I think for me, it was a part of the culture and growing up and school system and everything like that.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting in different regions. I found in just doing on a small scale, doing workshops and talking about this and stuff, I'll see more resistance from certain regions.
Right.
And other regions have more of a willingness to listen and try to understand the history. but it still begs the question about culture. You know, and language is part of culture, right? So speaking of culture, what kind of influence do you think music and art, comedy, and movies have on the use of the N-word?
The biggest influence.
Biggest?
To me, when we talk about my generation, you know, you have art and music and movies from the 90s and the 80s and the early 2000s where it was all about being black in America, right? And like I mentioned to you earlier, about being black in America was the clothes, the cars you drove, and the language that you used. And that was a part of the language. You have rappers like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and those kind of people, NWA and all those different groups that kind of told us that saying the word nigga was okay, and it was used out of a term of endearment. But you have to also look at it because they used it negatively as well. It's like a weapon, right?
True.
So
it's like a knife.
Right.
A knife can be used to heal or to kill.
Right.
Right.
And so so definitely music has been one of the biggest music and entertainment and TV has been one of the biggest influences on my generation.
Right. And of course we can't like deny that the rappers who used it in their music, they made a whole lot of money off the word too.
They did.
All due respect, because they sold records.
Right. But somebody else made a whole lot of money off of it too behind the scenes.
True that.
That don't look like us.
So hopefully we're not prostituting our oppression for money.
Our blackness is commoditized
right.
internationally, right?
Internationally, you're right.
It sells, right?
Yeah.
I think we're some of the coolest MFers around. Excuse my language, but you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Blackness equates to cool for a lot of people. You can go to different countries, especially Asia, and see women with micro braids, and you know what I mean? And the language is propagated to African countries who don't even understand. Within my generation, those people who don't understand where the word may have derived from, and so it's definitely interesting.
It is, and I've had experience. I think you've had an experience from people of African descent who are not from America, but are from somewhere else, and it's so interesting to get their take on the word. They, in some cases, I know in mine, they had never even heard of the word until they came here.
Right.
And then they had to learn what it meant without understanding the history.
Right.
I think you were saying that you ran into someone from another country that had that experience.
Right. And they said that their parents didn't even know what the word was during a certain time. And coming over here and kind of learning really what it meant, but somebody coming over here and growing up in this country and going through the American school system, they learned the N-word the same way I learned the N-word, and they use it the same way that I may have used it.
Well, for me, my initial introduction to it was as a result of my family. My family too is from Texas, from South Texas.
Right.
So we was on the south side, y'all was up north.
Yeah.
And and I had the blessing of understanding all the way back to my great-great-grandfather.
Okay.
And in fact, my great-grandfather was the product of a slave master. So hearing all these stories, and actually as a little boy being able to meet my great-grandfather, gave me this thirst for understanding history and my family and the slaves and the mixing of the races and this and that. So I got an education from my family first, from what this N-word means and the sting of it. So, and then of course going through the school system and then playing sports.
Right.
Unfortunately, well, in my perspective, unfortunately it's used a lot in that. And speaking of that, the NFL has just come out with a ruling, I believe, about the N-word. And there's been some pushback, I think, from black players, I think. Am I correct?
Right. And so that charge was led to ban the word was led by the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which is made up of a lot of ex football players, black football players, who at a time played when they had to break barriers, and the N word was slung at them, with intense and with ridicule. But now, you know, a lot of players are against it, and I think it's mainly because you can't tell me that I can't say this word, but any other offensive language is allowed. It's permissible, and that is a cultural thing.
Yeah.
You are pinpointing a certain group.
The only thing in the NFL, any language associated with homophobia is banned too.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
especially in the locker room, on the field, and in public. So that's out in
Okay.
the NFL also. But to your point, I can see where the pushback comes. I guess, you know, one of the players was talking about he had a problem with it because he said that word is part of our culture. And I'm like, okay, really? So again, it deserves a discussion to talk about, like we're doing now. And that's what that's what I hope our audience does. Man,
Right.
is I hope you take this. Don't worry whether you agree with me or agree with Dylan or you come together. You talk about it. You discuss it. You talk about the history if you think it deserves an understanding of the history. You talk about how it's used in music and this and that. Is that good? We have to talk about it. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. You really need to talk about this and other derogatory words.
Absolutely.
Because I think, for example, we talk about, because I've run into a few females, both black and white, who use the B word.
Okay.
Bitch.
Right.
So my question to them always is, okay, so what point in history did that word be associated with a human being?
Yeah.
Because the original meaning is about a female dog, correct? Who has a litter or can have litter. And no one knows.
Right.
It was during slavery.
Right.
It's again because the Africans were considered animals.
Well, what was the real term for a black slave? Woman. Nigga, bitch.
Correct. Meaning that she had the ability to produce a lot of offspring,
Right.
which would make the slave owner more rich.
Right.
Bang for your buck.
Right.
The black men were called bucks.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
You
called
taught
bucks.
me something.
Bang for your buck.
Wow.
He could produce, right? Thus starting the myth about, the male.
Right.
being-
I got
the
you.
black male being, we ain't going there yet.
Okay. Not this episode?
Not this one.
Okay.
There's a little truth to that. But yeah, I one of the other things that I've been exploring and trying to think about a little bit more was this term called internalized oppression, and how internalized oppression oftentimes is silent, it's unconscious. In fact, it's implicit in terms of a group of people adopting the method, the culture, the language, the art, the behavior of the oppressed power, right? And they do that because it helps them address their own fear of being inferior, fear of retribution for being an inferior group. So in other words, if they adopt the oppressive behavior in order to save themselves, if you will, socially, and that includes language.
Wow.
So it's internalized oppression, and again, that's something to study and think about. Have you seen examples of maybe an internalized oppression?
I would say, I know you and I had a conversation, and you mentioned Stephen A.
Stephen A. Smith,
Right.
the gentleman who's on, I think he's on ES.
Right. So, what are your thoughts about him associated with internalized oppression?
Well, I think it might be an example of his position on Kaepernick sometimes. That's just my opinion in terms of what he was saying, and also his defensiveness about the kickback he got from a lot of black folks who were offended by what he was saying. Basically, saying that Cap has to adjust to where he is, and the question being is why? Because that's who he is. He's wearing a Kunta Kinte T-shirt.
Right.
Why does that bother you? Right?
Yeah.
And so that's the question, and it bothers, basically saying it bothers him because it offends the power group. So I don't know. There's an internalized oppression, I think, in a lot of areas.
What's interesting? I guess you could argue that a lot of politicians are identified as having internalized oppression. But is it wrong to differ, to have a different thought process of how we can advance our people? You know, a lot of people call Toms if they think
Uncle Tom.
Uncle Tom. If you think
sellouts.
If you and I think a little bit different on
Correct.
how we should
Yeah.
achieve success for the black race.
Right.
But if you look back in history, I mean, you have people like Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X,
Yes.
Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, who
Correct.
all had different thought processes on how to attack overcoming oppression. And so I think we have to be careful as black people when we
I
try
totally
to tear
agree.
each other down.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree because, you know, I think it was, I think it was Cornel West. I don't want to misquote.
Okay.
But he said, you have to understand that black people are not monolithic in thought. We have different perspectives,
Right.
different thoughts. There's not one way to be black.
Right.
There's not one way to talk black, quote
Right.
unquote.
Right.
Right. So to your point, I totally agree. I think we, even within our intra-group, I think we have to consider, value, and respect each other's perspective.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of times people who have internalized the oppressive behavior of the power group actually in their heart believe they're helping their people.
Right.
When in fact they don't recognize the oppressive behavior that they're demonstrating themselves. So we got to be open. I want to thank you for joining us with this discussion. And again, I want to emphasize that the point of this was to hopefully stimulate you to have discussions with your family, your friends, your coworkers, and because we need to talk about this. There are a lot of things. And again, this is not the N-word is not the only word in the category of derogatory. It is not the only word we need to discuss, but we do need to talk about it. So have dinner or have lunch and have a 15-minute conversation about it. Consider the other perspective and see what you think. Don't hesitate to write and add your comments. Please subscribe to the channel because this is just one topic in many that we're going to address related to sport and social justice issues. And let's go from there. And don't forget, it's about time. Thank you. I want to thank Dylan.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care.